So here's my phone. It still could be. They were having lunch when I ran here. Unless, in terms of the attorney. Easier than we're sitting here. I know. I just checked all okay, so this is this. Okay, that's this, right? And yeah, so you gave one to Jane also. So okay.
No, I know on that. I think that's issues all over. I need issues.
Committee of conference on HB494 relative to Coakley Landfill. And, I believe that Representative Cushing has some ideas about where we might want to go from here, so I'd like him to speak to this.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Senate for being here and for the House for agreeing to a conference committee. I guess the question I'd like to get clarified in my mind is that the biggest change between the House and the Senate has been the decision to remove what was originally paragraph 2, which recognized that the situation with the Coakley Landfill Group concerning the, particularly the migration of toxins into Berry's Brook is not. It was not the language that declared it an imminent hazard has been removed, and I am curious as to why that took place. I don't think there's anything about the past 30 years or so of the operation of the Coakley landfill that would lead anyone to conclude that it was anything other than an imminent hazard. We have a situation where, 2 years ago, a number of us were in receipt of a letter from the DES acknowledging that there was migration from the site that it needed to be taken care of. The definition of hazardous, imminent hazard is contained in our SA 147A, which gives DES the authority to order the necessary steps to eliminate the hazard. It also permits the Attorney General's office to bring an action for injunctive relief, including a mandatory injunction. I think if I want to acknowledge the acts of the Department of Fish and Game, which recognizing that there were dangerous chemicals, toxins that were leaking from the landfill site into Berry's Brook, were prudent enough to post a warning to establish that, to encourage people not to say that you should not consume fish being taken from that place. The testing of that site by independent, but the testing site has indicated that there are PFAs in that site that in many ways exceed over 28 times what the acceptable limit would be in New Jersey for those type of PFAs. So I guess I'm just trying to understand why the Senate doesn't think it's an imminent hazard.
In researching the definition for imminent hazard means that, and I'm sorry, I should have it in my folder, I don't seem to, but that, there is an immediate emergency. It's something that didn't exist yesterday and it's something that is eminent today and has to be resolved immediately. This is not a situation that can be resolved under that definition of eminent hazard. So that's why it's important to remove that language, and at the same time, I think we note that in the bill, we kept all of the language about the history of this issue, and we are trying to move forward within the consent decree in a responsible manner, and so that the bill calls for the Department of Environmental Services working with the Coakley Landfill Group, working with the EPA to propose a remedy, to put a cost to that remedy, so that we know exactly what it is in terms of what the solution would be. For us to say tomorrow, you have to solve this when we don't know and we don't have the data or the design, whatever it is, to move forward with the appropriate remedy. So we're not saying that there's not a critical problem there, but it's not an eminent hazard.
I just think that, as we know.
We can disagree.
We disagree. I just think that, that if anything, the cause for it being an imminent hazard was strengthened when our Attorney General, just subsequent to the adoption of this bill, filed suit against PFAS manufacturers. And the language in that lawsuit that outlines what the threat is to public health, it did not preclude Coakley. If anything, it reinforced the need for that. I think that the state of New Hampshire is going to go into Superior Court in the state to seek relief and to seek damages against the manufacturers of PFAS, when the PFAS are existing in, for instance, Barry's Brook, which is the subject of this legislation. If it's important enough for this Attorney General to go and sue in state court the manufacturers, it should be important enough for us to order the DES to come up with a cleanup remedy.
Well, we are DES to come up with a remedy. We're just not including the language that has to do with eminent hazard, and that's the difference.
Okay, Representative White. Did you have a?
I think we have to be careful not to conflate the Attorney General seeking financial remedy, which is going to be staggering, with imminent hazard. I think the two are disparate issues, and they don't necessarily conflate. It's primarily driven by the economics in the Attorney General's suit, not by any imminence. I just thought that was important to mention.
So I think that what we need to think more about going forward, and I think that if we are going to accept the idea that the term imminent hazard may not be what is most useful at this point, then let's see if we can come up with, look at some actual remedies that we would like to demand. And I believe that Representative Cushing has some language that we might want to look at.
I have some language that, I'm sorry, I don't have the, I do not have, oh, you should give me one, Representative. Just please give them to the Senate, thank you.
My purpose.
It's a suggestion. It's a suggestion for some language I think would be a little bit more. Building off the Senate amendment, this would be an adjustment to the remedy that was included in the Senate version. And I say that I apologize that OLS didn't complete a draft, and I checked it before I came. And what it does, if you want to take a look at it, the changes that are made include recognizing that it would direct that by November 1, the 2019, Department of Environmental Service should require the Coakley Landfill Group to propose a design solution, provide cost estimates, and an implementation schedule under the applicable consent decree involving the Coakley Landfill Site for an appropriate interim remedial measure to ensure the substantial reduction of contaminants entering Barry's Brook from the Coakley Landfill Superfund Site. The proposal will include on-site construction for the interim remedial solution by July 1, 2020. And it further seeks, below it it's suggested, it says the Attorney General may seek such a remedy through any means appropriate consistent with the consent decree. So I think it addresses Representative Clark's concern about the consent decree, and it provides a timetable and more direct guidance for DES to prepare this. It does not say that it will be CLG that will, or it just simply puts it upon our Department of Environmental Services.
And what's interesting is that I do have an amendment here that also called for an appropriate, would a reasonable timetable for implementing the proposed remedies. So I think that we can agree with however we want that language to read, that is an important addition to add to the bill. I would like to hear, I think that as we've heard from DES, they cannot require the Coakley landfill to do anything. So we don't want to tie their hands. I think it's the Department of Environmental Services that should be proposing the design solution, providing the cost estimates, not requiring the Coakley landfill group to do that. But it does say they must work with the EPA, they must work with the Coakley landfill group, but it's really their responsibility to bring that forward. And I think that is the appropriate way to proceed. If the EPA and the Coakley landfill group don't want to work with the Department of Environmental Services, then environment still has to bring this forward. But I think it's important that we recommend to them that they solicit input from both those two entities, because they're the ones that are involved ultimately with the consent decree. So I think this language shall require the Coakley landfill group is not acceptable.
If I might, I would suggest that, in fact, the contamination that is in Berry's Brook is outside of the Coakley landfill site. That the consent decree reserved to the state the authority to deal with hazardous waste management. That that it is entirely appropriate under 147A for DES to direct the to direct the polluters to stop polluting and to come up with a plan to do that. And that's why we rely. That's why the reliance was upon the hazard, the imminent hazard status.
Sherman?
I'm
Senator Sherman, sorry.
fine with that. Honored. I first of all just wanted to make a comment on imminent hazard. My understanding is that imminent hazard actually gives DES, if they declare something an imminent hazard, it gives them the capacity to move without legislation, without us having to do anything. And DES has chosen not to declare it an imminent hazard. So I agree with the Senate version that it doesn't need to be in this bill, because we as the legislature actually have the right to direct DES to do something. We don't have to declare anything. So so that's point number one, is that whether or not we call it an imminent hazard, we can still ask DES to go ahead and clean this up. And it's also, and this is more of a question, it is my understanding that in any situation where there is environmental contamination, DES can require the polluter to do the cleanup. So I'm just asking the question, this is a case where there is EPA involvement, but that is within a specified zone, and this contamination is outside that zone. Does that allow DES to go ahead and require the polluters, not necessarily CLG, in this case it probably is CLG, but to require the polluters to do the cleanup and fund it? I'm asking that question. I don't know if anybody else has any answer.
I'd like to make a comment about imminent hazard. I think I would still call it an imminent hazard. I've been calling it an imminent hazard for years.
but it hasn't been recognized. But if Fish and Game is posting, do not eat the fish from the brook, or catch and release, then that's gonna be an imminent hazard definition.
And the question, I think one of the issues in terms of looking at it as an imminent hazard is what the imminent hazard RSA does is it gives DES the authority to act. They have chosen not to act, and it may be, I think that Senator Sherman might be on the mark here by saying that whether or not it is being called an imminent hazard, we as the legislature do have the capacity to compel DES to take certain steps. And I think that it might be more effective in terms of getting to a solution in this legislative session to think about what exactly are the steps we are going to ask DES to take. And I was wondering, Senator Fuller-Clark, do you have other extra copies of the amendment?
Yeah, it's very simple, and I'm happy to hand it down.
We can ask them. Would you like to? So, let's see, Commissioner Whipsett, would you be willing to answer a couple of questions?
Certainly.
Thank you, take my question. If we all agree that something needs to be done immediately, what will your department, how will you proceed with the legislation if we do come to an agreement?
Thank you. Well, it's certainly kind of what the bill says, what the directive is. Based on what's been discussed to date, we're in a difficult situation in the sense that as a Superfund site, the activities of the responsible parties are largely governed by the consent decrees associated with this particular settlement of this particular site. EPA is the lead agency in that regard, so we work closely with them. It would really depend on what we were directed to do, how we would proceed. If we were directed to specifically develop, for DES to develop a remedy for Berry's Brook, we would work with the CLG to the extent that they were cooperative and EPA to try to figure out what that could look like and try to propose something.
Just to follow up, the consent decree just involves the Superfund site, correct? Just the landfill?
Well, it actually involves both the landfill and impacted groundwater. That it goes.
So it
it's not
does
on the
include
landfill
Berry's
site.
Berry's Brook.
It certainly includes areas around the site where contaminants have migrated. And that's I want to say it's a simple answer. It's a more complex legal answer because the site is divided into two compartments and there are separate consent decrees that govern each of those. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to specifically give you a really parsed out explanation of that, but those differences and those provisions are contained in the two consent decrees.
So could I just follow up and
Yes,
ask this question? It's my understanding that this is based on the belief that contamination is coming from the Coakley Landfill site
Yes.
that is flowing into Berry Brook. So I don't think you can say that they're not connected, right? That's-
Oh, I'm not for a moment
No,
saying
but I'm not
they're
saying you, but I'm just asking you because we're hearing that, the consent decree only covers the Coakley landfill. And there are two different consent decrees, I agree, but also even if it only, there was some disagreement about what it covers, in the end, the assumption is that the pollution is coming from the Coakley landfill. Is that correct?
I don't think there's any disagreement among the parties that the concentrations of PFAS that we detect in the upper reaches of Berry's Brook are would come from the landfill site. No, I haven't heard anyone suggest that, so.
So, I've been looking at the amendment that Senator Fuller Clark has put forward and the one that the House has put forward. And what I see as the key differences are that the House's proposal would ask DES to require Coakley Landfill to do the design solution, whereas the Senate version would require DES to do that proposal for the design solution. And the House version has a deadline for starting actual work on the solution by July 20th, in July of 2020, and the Senate version has no deadline on that. And are there other differences that I'm missing there?
There is one other difference at the very bottom
That's for the...
where it talks about, in the amendment, it's provided by the House that the Attorney General may seek, what, that's a typo there?
Oh, yeah.
It should be may seek, no?
And in our bill, it says shall seek.
Okay. And,
That's the
Representative Senator Sherman would like to address that?
I don't know if there's anybody here from the Attorney General's office, but I have heard that the legislature can't compel, and that's the only reason, I mean, shall is better in my book, but I think, and Greg is nodding his head, that the legislature cannot compel, you're shaking your head.
I'll defer to Senator Fuller Clark.
Could I just say that it's our understanding that because we're asking the Attorney General, and it says consistent with the consent decree, that there has been a legal document that has been signed between, regarding the Superfund site. And so all we're asking here, and that we are legally entitled to do that, is telling the Attorney General that he shall implement, find any means appropriate, because he has a responsibility to maintain the contracts that have been signed. Those are legal documents.
Okay.
I agree. I believe that you should do it. I just know that there's a separation of powers issue involved. I want to be respectful of it. I know that if you look, for instance, at the hazardous waste management statute, it says the department may take actions necessary to prevent damage to health, to human health or environment, or it can request the Attorney General to bring an action for injunctive relief, including mandated. So it's a request of the Attorney General to do that. And what the proposal would be that it would be more, it's like, please do your job.
I just wanted to tell you that we did do legal research that it's the belief that we could keep the word shall, but if everybody would prefer may, that's fine.
I would prefer shall.
I'm just saying, I'm trying to explain the rationale for what was in this.
Okay, so I think that we could probably agree on the shall, if I were asking a body to do something about a problem, I would like to be asking the body that I have a little bit more direct control over to do it, and I think that would be DES rather than the Coakley Landfill Group. I'm not sure how my House colleagues feel about that, but I don't know. I think it might be more effective to ask DES to come up with a solution and the timeline and the cost estimates, and then impose those on Coakley.
So I'd like to speak to the section that deals with must include initiation on-site construction. The whole reason that we have asked for DES to report back by November 1st is we then will have the capacity to understand what's involved with the remedy, what it's going to cost, and how easily and how long it will take for that remedy to be put in place. And we certainly can then move forward with additional legislation at that time. But we don't have the information right now to know if it's even practical to say that they should include an initiation of the on-site construction by July 1st. We don't know who's going to pay for it, all right? You know, and that's a whole nother issue, and we don't know how to address how it's going to be paid for until we know what it's going to cost. So I think that's not also workable at this particular time. It doesn't mean that, you know, once we've seen that implementation schedule, that we cannot move forward on how that can be actually installed.
Yeah, I have a question, for you, Senator. Isn't the Coakley Landfill Group responsible for the cleanup? So you just said that you don't know who the responsible party is.
Well, I'm not saying the responsible party, but, you know, we need to know how to engage the Superfund, the EPA, and the Coakley Landfill, or decide if we're not going to take that responsibility and insist that they take that responsibility, or they refuse. But we don't even know what it is that we're going to be asking the Coakley Landfill or the EPA to pay for. So until we know that, I think it's just not, it doesn't make sense to me that all of a sudden we're going to say, not only do you have to have all this information, but you have to go ahead with that remedy when we don't have the information in front of us as to actually what that remedy is and how easy and how long it would take to install it.
Respectfully, I think that it is important that we get it cleaned up. I don't want to get in a situation where we're going to say it costs us too much to not have cancer around the Coakley Landfill.
And I'm not implying that representative.
Well, I'm just saying that somehow there has to be, it's akin to, I think it's analogous to going to the emergency room at the hospital, and before anyone wants to operate on you, they want to make sure that you have your insurance is all in order, someone's going to pay for it. And I think that's the kind of situation we're in right now.
But it's my Senator Biden.
Senator Biden?
Yeah, I would not necessarily agree with that. I would say that the emergency room surgeons are going to do their job based upon the data that they collect on what the problem is. And we're not allowing that process to go forward. We had this considerable discussion on that in the Senate, that we're trying to articulate a solution for a problem whose definition we don't know the limits of in terms of cost.
So could I also say that my concern is that we must find a way to bring the Coakley Landfill Group and the EPA on board, because if we don't, and we move towards compelling an action outside of their participation, we risk violating the consent decree, and we're going to end up in litigation, which means that we'll slow everything down just that much more. So I'm not willing to have that happen at this particular juncture.
Representative. I'm wondering if there's a middle ground. First of all, I think we've said multiple times in this bill that there is, that would actually represent the Senate side. We've said multiple times in this bill that this is all being done within the consent decree. So I don't think either side is saying it should be within the consent decree. And I could see a huge reluctance to move forward, as Senator Guida had said, if the burden of the cost of this were going to be on the state. But that's not what we're saying, and that's not the way DES has worked in the past. When there's a known polluter and there's contamination, the DES goes after the polluter. This is outside of the Coakley Landfill Group, and so I'm wondering if we could put in language that would say, give a timeline on a remedy, and say that in terms of the cost, put a clause in there that if the cost is not to be borne by the polluter,
then that requires some kind of reconsideration. So in other words, what I agree with pretty much everything that's been said, in that we don't want to slow things down. It's my assumption that the polluter is going to be paying the cost, not the state. And under that assumption, I don't see why we need to hold this up, why we can't build a timeline, move forward under that assumption, unless there is something in the consent decree, which is in here already, that puts us on hold, or for some reason the polluter isn't going to pay for it and the bill comes back to the state. That would be the second part that would trigger a reconsideration. In other words, we move forward with the assumption the polluter is going to pay for this. We don't wait. We set a timeline in the bill, similar, but maybe not quite as quick as, because I think it takes more time to put these plans together, but we set a timeline in the bill that would start the implementation of this. The assumption is that it's not the state that's going to bear the cost, it's the Coakley Landfill Group that's going to bear the cost. And then the two triggers for reconsideration are we outside of the consent decree? And the second trigger is, wait a second, if there's state funds involved, that's not anticipated by this bill. This bill anticipates that it'd be standard practice by DES that they would hold the polluter accountable. I'm just floating that as an in-between.
So, your response.
I think as long as we can have some sort of specific deadline for actually starting work on the actual remediation, I think that that's something we could work with.
So, do you understand my, is that?
I do, I think it's, first of all, it would be important how we define polluter, all right? And right now, we know that we have those lawsuits out, we have the lawsuits that are out there.
Well, the polluter in this case is CLG.
The
We've already
CLG.
established that.
Okay.
I mean, Mike is on the system. So the two conditions that you've already put in the one condition, which is that it has to be done within the consent. The second condition is that we're going to put a wait a second in there if the state is going to be incurring the cost of the cleanup for whatever reason.
Okay, so we put in a clause that says that needs to, or we work with a clause that says work needs to be initiated by this time, this date certain. And then we have a escape clause that if the Coakley Landfill fails to meet their financial obligation, then we need to be, it's possible to change that date certain.
Well, then we need to have there would need to be that would be the implementation phase. Everything else would be done, right? So you'd have your plan in place, you'd have cost estimates, you'd have all of that. The responsible party is the polluter, which is Coakley Landfill Group. And if for whatever reason it doesn't look like they're going to be footing the bill and the state and state dollars, then you're talking about a fiscal note, and you're talking about the responsible thing is to take a breath. And I'm not sure who would do that, whether it's the who would be the review, the person who would come back and look at the state cost and be able to, maybe the fiscal committee or somebody like that. But the idea would be that it would be a legislative body that would be able to take a second look at it and make sure that that we're protective of state cost. I think that's, and I don't mean to put words in Senator Clark's.
You're not.
I think that's, all of us share that concern of unanticipated state costs.
Well, I'm not, I think that if you look at the last sentence, right, where it says, that if there is no written agreement among the Department of Environmental Services, the Coakley Landfill Group, and the EPA as to an acceptable remedy and implementation schedule, then the Office of the Attorney General may seek such a remedy through any means appropriate. So I think we've left escape language there that we don't need to sort of qualify this, because we can go to the Attorney General's office and say no written agreement was achieved, and it's now time for the Attorney General and his office to take action.
Is there a way that we can get a date certain for actual work being done?
I don't think so, because I don't think we know what that work is, and we don't know how long. We can ask the commissioner.
To be clear, I'm director, so I don't want to.
I know, someone called the commissioner, and I thought, did I miss something?
Somebody before you missed something. Yeah, I think it's difficult to say when something like that could start, because we don't even know what it is yet. We don't know what the design will look like. We don't know how long it will take to complete a final design and to get to construction. And of course, as the Kurt's discussed here, it then becomes a question of how that gets paid for, and who actually conducts it.
But it's been 2 years since you all seems to acknowledge that there was a problem with migrating toxins into Berry's Brook that needed to be cleaned up. And all it's been is 2 years. I don't know what's been done.
To be clear, Representative, we have worked with the City of Portsmouth and the CLG to try to convince them that they can do something on a voluntary basis. I do want to clarify, the department stated back then and still maintains that it's never good when contaminants are migrating off of the site. Unfortunately, we have contaminants migrating off of sites all over the state. That's why they're sites. We're not really in a strong position to enforce and require a specific cleanup unless we have a standard that's been exceeded. And in this case, we do not have an applicable surface water standard that we could use as an enforcement tool. If we did, then we might be having a very different conversation. But we're not in a position to do that now. So the letter that the agency wrote 2 years ago has been broadly cited, and if you read it, we stand by everything that's in that letter, but that doesn't equate to the agency having the legal authority to compel the responsible party to implement a remedy.
I'm just saying, if it's the absence of a standard, you have all the authority to protect public health to initiate emergency rulemaking and adopt a standard, right?
We do have authority to adopt emergency rules and standards or through normal rulemaking. However, we've not done the necessary work to establish an appropriate standard, and as you probably know, Senate Bill 309 in last year's session directed us to develop a plan and a budget for setting a surface water standard, which the agency's water division is working on right now. And that plan and budget are due to be submitted to the legislature in January 1.
But even though New Jersey has standards, we don't have them yet, right? That's correct.
Can I ask about the consent decree? I haven't, it's been a while since I've read it. Is there any mention about contamination or spreading or what remedies should be taken if there should be hazardous, toxins leaching from the site? Is that in the consent decree?
There are references to enforceable standards in the consent decree, and among them, there are drinking water MCLs, state and groundwater quality standards, and surface water quality standards. So those are, in most cases, enforceable within the context of the consent decree. So certainly, consent decrees anticipate that there's a concern about off-site contamination.
But the consent decree was predicated upon the expectation that nothing would be migrating off the site. It's migrating off the site. The consent decree's been violated.
With all due respect, I don't want to get into a debate with you about what the consent decree anticipated or didn't anticipate. The agency manages 20 Superfund sites and several hundred hazardous waste sites. In almost all cases, there is some migration off the site of contaminants, either through the groundwater or the surface water pathway, and that's why those sites pose challenges. But to say that the consent decree assumed there would be no migration off the site is just not correct.
And I'm going to, because the 1.4 dioxins which are in the golf course wells, the agency, DES, was able to act and order CLG to do something about that, right?
That's correct, because we had an enforceable standard for that.
Would there be any way for us to require emergency rulemaking to establish standards for these contaminants? Could we do that within a timeline? I'm not sure how long that takes usually, but could we say by November 1st, we must have standards set up, or whatever date we might choose? Because it sounds like these standards are a lot of our problem if we don't have them.
So it's my understanding that the Department of Environmental Resources is working on those standards right now, and that is part of what the previous bill required. As you heard, they will be presenting those standards no later than January 1st of 2020. But they don't have them yet. Okay? And it's the whole issue of making sure that they've used the appropriate science to be able to defend those standards. That's what you're working on right now. Is that correct?
To be clear, Senator, what Senate Bill 309 requires is that the agency develop a plan and budget for developing a certain standards for PFAS compounds, not to actually develop those standards. So January 1, that plan and budget will be presented, and then presumably thereafter would be implemented. And that, to be very, transparent, that will take many months of work, more than a year, to develop a defensible, appropriate standard. It's important to understand that the agency has never unilaterally developed a surface water quality standard. We have traditionally, as many states do, relied on EPA to provide us with the core primary science on those issues, and then we do some work to try to evaluate that science in the context of New Hampshire's environment, and then propose state surface water quality standards. But we're not getting that from EPA right now. So I know there's frustration about the time involved in this, but what the agency is doing is setting up a plan to implement a series of various pieces of work that it will need to complete in order to have the information we need to set surface water quality standards, because we're not going to get that information from the US EPA.
Let me ask you another question. We know right now that you're finding PFAS in the Berry Brook. So we don't have to wait for the surface water standard to be able to remedy that area of the site, but we don't know yet what that remedy would be and how it would be installed.
We don't currently have authority. Under the Superfund process, the responsible party does have a responsibility to evaluate and manage any risks associated with the site. And we have certainly looked at the surface water quality concentrations in Berry's Brook, and we've seen high numbers right immediately adjacent to the landfill and a short distance downstream where it passes Breakfast Hill Road. Once we get to Breakfast Hill Road and we look at the numbers downstream, we don't see numbers that, given the intended and expected uses of Berry's Brook for recreation, we don't see numbers in there that, based on EPA's risk analysis, that pose an unacceptable risk to users of the stream. So that, if there were, there might have, we probably have EPA in our corner here with the ability to require some kind of remedial work. But because they haven't demonstrated that, EPA is not comfortable, it doesn't feel that, at least to date, it has not seen its way clear to require the CLG to do any specific work to remedy the brook. So To the extent we can get cooperation from the CLG, and which we would very much like to have, we think there may well be some remedial measures that could be taken to reduce the concentrations of PFAS in Berry's Brook to slow the migration. And we're certainly interested in pursuing those in concert with CLG. But that's a different matter from being able to unilaterally take an action to compel them to do that work. And that's why we're
Be really clear. First of all, I really don't think it's any kind of excuse for inaction that we have multiple sites of contamination around the state. That to me is not a valid excuse. What we have in Berry's Brook is we have known flowing surface water into a fairly, as you've already said, pristine watershed. So unlike the aquifer under Cape Cod, we have an opportunity here to prevent a natural disaster from the continuing out migration of contaminants from the known polluting source. And that's already been established. So to say that we are not going to act because we've got multiple sites around the state, my point would be, I'm cheering on the Attorney General to find us the resources as Vice Chair of the Drinking Water Advisory Council. And I'm absolutely cheering on the Attorney General to help us find those resources. In the meantime, it's my understanding that it is the standard of practice of DES to, if you have a known polluter and you have known pollution, whether or not there's a health hazard, which there is, we've got an environmental disaster that is ongoing right now. You've said it in your letter 2 years ago. And many times in the state, we don't wait for the federal government. And I think if we wait for the EPA, I may be dead by the time there's a reasonable standard for flowing water. So we do, as the legislative body of this state, we can ask you to go ahead and make that plan, give us the cost estimates, do everything you possibly can do to compel the polluters to cover it. And if they don't meet the timeline set by the legislature, which my proposal would be next spring in March, I think January is a little fast, but March, that we review that. And I think Senator Fuller-Clark is correct. It may be the Attorney General is the best mechanism for doing that review and making sure the state is doing everything they can, not only to protect human health, but to protect the environment. The state of Minnesota won an $880 million settlement, not because of human health from PFAS, but from environmental contamination. This is, to me, we have an opportunity to stop the contamination downstream in the watershed of Berry's Brook. We know it's going to happen. These chemicals don't go away. They don't biodegrade. And downstream from Berry's Brook, I will remind all of you, and Senator Fuller-Clark and I have talked about this a lot, is Little Harbor, the Piscataqua River, the Atlantic Ocean, and it's a place where many of us recreate, and it's a place where people from out of the state recreate. What's at threat are our fisheries and tourism, if not our own people. So it's time for the legislature to act. I think Senator Fuller-Clark's amendment with possibly with an additional timeline of March for implementation, unless, and that's where, and maybe the wording's already there, but unless the funding is not going to be covered by the polluter, because then I think we start looking at the fiscal impact on the state.
Well, thank you. I think it's definitely a mistake to wait for EPA to hand us some standards. And how many other states have set their own standard? I know I've heard about New Jersey mentioned.
Michigan.
Are there others?
There's a handful of states that have not been.
Vermont, Michigan.
And I know you can't really speak for them, but I assume if there's a general consensus, I'm assuming that they're right around the same value, their standards. So that sounds to me like there might be at least some degree of settled science around this. We don't need to wait for the federal government to just deliver us standards.
And to be clear, we're not waiting for that. We're putting a plan together to do that primary work ourselves.
Okay. Is there any way we can kind of speed that up? Because we talked about, there's a January 1 due date for making a plan to make a determination, which seems a little ridiculous to me. Is there any way that we could get those standards, could we require those standards to be set by a certain date?
I think that is actually a different piece of legislation. But I think that the other thing is that what this bill is doing, if we don't require those MCLs, having those MCLs available would make it potentially fall under the imminent hazard issue. But we know that, as Senator Sherman pointed out, we know that there is contamination that is leaving the Coakley landfill and headed downstream, and it might not have reached Little Harbor yet, but that yet is critical. And we have the Great Bay Estuary is one of the most productive fish hatcheries, fish spawning grounds on the East Coast. If Great Bay is harmed by the pollution from Coakley landfill, that is a real disaster on a number of different levels. We can't wait until it gets there. We need to act now. And I think that the Senate plan is actually very close to giving us what we need. I think that if we add some language in terms of a real time for that implementation to start, then I would be willing to go with this. And Senator Sherman, did you have some idea about how to add a little bit of language to sort of push the process forward a little?
My only response is that I've been working on this for, I don't know, at least 3 years or so, and science does already exist for how to do this. The question is how you specifically apply that science to Berry Brook. And so I would ask maybe Mr. Hoffman or Mr. Wimsett what would be a reasonable time, but I would think no greater than 6 months from the time the plan is designed. So if we set a plan by November 1, then that would put us towards March, April, that time frame for starting the work of implementation.
Director Wimsatt?
The only thing I would say is that whether we would have complete design by then, I don't know. But also, if you have a design that's likely going to require construction of some system in wetland areas or in drainage areas, and March and April are the primary high flow times for the winter runoff. So that's probably not a great time to be doing construction. Ideally, you could probably do construction with the least amount of damage and the easiest way to implement it effectively and construct where you're really trying to construct during a low water period in the summer.
So that would be starting in July?
Like in August.
So construction over the summer with a completion date, I don't know how long it would take.
I think maybe I don't think you need, I think it would be problematic to put a completion date in,
Right.
but I think the initiation date of July 1st would be, I think that would be reasonable.
So, are there any other ideas right now that we need to put out here? And then I think we need to take, if they're not, we need to take a break and talk about amongst ourselves what is or is not acceptable and then come back.
Okay.
Now the question is, it's 2:30. Do people want to come back today or do they want to wait and come back tomorrow morning?
See today. Let's see, we have, a couple of us have another meeting at 3.
Three, right. So do you want to come back at 4?
Yeah, we can do that.
I've got a county convention.
Oh, okay. I think that our 3 o'clock will be done by 3:30. So let's come back at 3:30, and if you could have some language drafted with that July 1st implementation date added in, with a wording that you'd be happy with, that would help.
So we added to the 4 o'clock.
Right.
We will discuss.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we will take a break until 3:30.